Do any of you have Jeremy Chong's number? Jeremy Chong, no? Dylan here. Yeah, is Dylan here? If someone get Dylan or Jeremy? Okay. You know, it's better if you guys just push the tables to the wall and then there's more people that discuss. And then we can just push the tables to the wall and then okay, let's start. We're really pretty close to the office. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to semi-final 1 in opening government. We have UNB. In opening opposition, we have Mara G. In closing government, we have Mara B. And in closing opposition, we have CFSA. This is a really small room, so standard decorum has to apply. Let's just keep the chapter to a minimum. I don't think anyone else can come in during the debate, so it doesn't matter, but please do not leave or enter the room in between speeches. Keep your phones off, and let's just keep this room as silent as possible. It will help everyone to enjoy the debate. Who's keeping time? Can someone help you with that? All right, thank you. All right, then without further ado, we've got on the Prime Minister over there. Yeah.
There are many atrocities that have long gone unchecked. The fight against ISIL should no longer be an isolated one, but we think that we should take a more collaborative effort into fighting ISIL. what is the status quo right now? What's happening, right? Firstly, we think that ISIL is expanding at a very alarming rate. Even right now, they're still fighting to hold on to Kobani, right? At the same time, they're also mounting attacks to Aleppo, a city in Syria, Mr. Speaker. So we think that this is a plague that must be stopped right now, right? What are the efforts that's being done towards ISIL? We see Air Force strikes towards ISIL by the US. We see that, but the thing is, Mr. Speaker, has it been effective? We don't think so. ISIL is still very much at large. But we believe that it's time to introduce a new ally into this fight. And who is this ally we're talking about? Bashar Al-Assad, right? Mr. Speaker, what is our mechanism for today's debate? We think that it's time to let Assad-led Syria to cooperate with the West. How? By military forces, by providing them a base, providing them a base for military use, by giving any other form of collaboration. Basically, that's fine as long as they join forces at the end of the day. Unite. What is our stance for today? We on the opening government will prove to you why we believe that this cooperation is legitimate, and we'll tell you, right, why we believe that this is in the best interest of the West to help Bashar al-Assad in combating ISIL. I'll talk to you on two arguments. Firstly, I'll be analyzing the extent of how Assad's regime has dealt with the ISIL and how it's failed, Mr. Speaker. And I'll tell you on how it's in the best interest of the West to do so. Patrick here will talk about three substantive. Firstly, on how this will help the Syrians, right? And secondly, how it will provide a form of geopolitical stability. And lastly, on how we will provide global stability tonight. Now, my first argument, Speaker, I'm going to talk to you on how Assad has been fighting right now. Mr. Speaker, we think that Assad has been sending troops towards the borders of Syria. We think that they have been under attack by ISIL because ISIL is currently expanding. They're no longer attacking mainly Iraq. They want to go to the neighboring countries and take over there too and expand their ideologies, Mr. Speaker. We think that Assad is not at the best level to fight ISIL. They are under attack and their allies are in no position to help them, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because ISIS has always been in Iraq. But right now, they've shifted over to conquer Syria. Now, US has been helping Iraq in fighting ISIL, but they're not helping Assad because they question the characteristics of Assad. Now, I'll tell you that, hold on, before that opening.
Most or if not all of ISIS resources, for example, oil fields and banks, are concentrated in Iraq. Don't you think that defeating IS in Iraq will enable us to defeat them in Syria without having to cooperate with Bashar al-Assad?
Don't you think that's what we've been trying to do right now, but we've been failing, Mr. Speaker? The very fact that they've expanded towards the territories of Syria shows to you that stopping them at Iraq is no longer possible, Mr. Speaker. So we should stop them from attacking Syria as well, Mr. Speaker, before they can expand to other neighboring countries, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that stopping Iraq as only, you should only stop Iraq, Mr. Speaker. You can do both at the same time. So that's what we want US to do right now. Why do we tell you that, why do we say that US has not been helping Assad in fighting ISIL, right, Mr. Speaker? Because Assad isn't exactly the same. We acknowledge the fact that Assad has been using force against the rebels in his own country. We acknowledge the fact that he's been using chemical weapons against his rebels, right, Mr. Speaker? But we think at this particular scenario, what Assad has been doing has been in the best interest, has been in the interest of maintaining his own political stance, his own political stance within his own country. We don't think he has never committed atrocities like what ISIL has done, Mr. Speaker. He has never done genocide like what ISIL has done. He has never not been doing the crimes that ISIL has done, like enslaving women, Mr. Speaker, like beheading journalists from foreign countries who are not even part of the fight in the first place. He has never done this kind ethnic cleansing like what ISIL has done. So we don't think that Assad in particular has to be penalized, has to be penalized and his country should be neglected for this particular for this particular crime, Mr. Speaker. We think that in this common ground where we have a common enemy, which is ISIL, which is basically a harm towards human rights. Everyone, Mr. Speaker, who is basically committing monstrous crime. We think that an enemy to your enemy is basically your friend, right, Mr. Speaker? So we should fight with Assad into combating ISIL. Before that, yes.
How do you think Sunni Muslims around the world are going to receive the West cooperating with an actor, a Shiite, that's used chemical weapons on their own people, targeting Sunni Muslims?
So we don't think the West has any particular interest into choosing either Shias or Sunni in the first place, Mr. Speaker, because the fight between Shias or Sunni is subjective. There is no right or wrong in which particular belief that you have, Mr. Speaker. So we think that the West has that particular right to defend. Now, generally, Mr. Speaker, we think that the whole world basically agrees that ISIL is a threat, Mr. Speaker. So we don't think that anyone will blame US for supporting, for preventing extremists and terrorists like ISIL. So moving on to the second argument on how this is in the best interest of the West. Mr. Speaker, we think that Turkey hasn't been helping much in fighting ISIL, possibly because of the Kurds issue, right, Mr. Speaker? We think that US needs an ally. And airstrikes basically isn't working a lot, Mr. Speaker. And why they should fight against ISIL is because they want to maintain geopolitical stability within that area as well, Mr. Speaker. Because if ISIL were to take over Syria, we think things will get alarmingly worse. Why? Because as bad as Assad is, as bad as Syria is right now, they are still able to negotiate with you, Mr. Speaker. Unlike ISIL, which will never be able to negotiate with you. That's why we think that it's better for US to maintain the safe state of Syria that way. That's why US should interfere and help Assad, Mr. Speaker. We think that our proposal is more relevant now because we have a direct because ISIL has been mobilizing itself into accessing Syria, right? And this is because they have been mobilizing their forces into Syria. We think that it's US can actually have a say, can actually do more now, and allies of that's why we say that we should be allies with a lesser evil, Mr. Speaker. And we don't and the very fact that we're allying ourselves with Assad doesn't mean that he'll get away scot-free for what he's done, Mr. Speaker. We're not saying that we're going to neglect everything he's done. At the end of the day, his crimes can still be discussed in a court of law, Mr. Speaker, if we choose to do so. But let's solve the problem, the evil at hand. With that, we beg to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister for that speech. We also thank the audience for keeping their sense of minimum. Let's keep this going. We call upon the leader of Mosque. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, UTMARA believes that Syria, as well as Bashar Al-Assad, poses no strategic or military advantage to the battle that is currently being fought by the coalition of the willing, and that it is morally reprehensible as well as politically foolish for the United States to cooperate with an enemy it has already pledged and committed to destroy. And we think that holds terrible repercussions to not just Western and United States exceptionalism within the world, it will also harm us as to how we deal with enemies in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is not about whether or not defeating ISIL is important or whether or not ISIL or Assad is worse off. This debate is about three things. First, whether or not it is necessary for the coalition of the willing to cooperate with Assad to achieve some sort of military victory in Syria and defeating ISIL. Secondly, whether or not that cooperation will succeed or whether or not victory is even more imminent with Assad's cooperation. And lastly, what are the implications of this cooperation for the West in terms of how we deal with Western exceptionalism, deal with our national security, as well as military capacities in future interventions. The model that we support in opening opposition is status quo. We agree that the coalition of the willing that is made up of the United States, Australia, United Kingdom, and France are doing a good job. We're already cooperating with the Iraqi government, Kurdish forces, as well as the Peshmerga forces within Iraqi Kurdistan, and soon to be Turkey, who's going to join us after they sort out their political problems. We were happy with the airstrike conducted within not just Iraq, but in Syria as well. So we'll target them in Iraq as well as airstrikes in Syria. We don't need Assad's permission for that. Before I move on to my argumentation, let me deal with just one point of rebuttal. The fundamental problem with the government team is that they firstly never told us what added military advantage Assad can bring us to the table. Secondly, they never told us why. Secondly, we tell you that most of the benefits that opening government brought were contingent on this military action being successful. Lastly, they forgot to talk about any consequences to the West if we go on with this model. But the one rebuttal I have, Assad is not as bad as ISIL. First response, we think it's wrong to place a value judgment as to who has been hurt more by which party, because 70,000 people dying in the Syrian civil war, people being, permanently, physically decapitated through chemical weapons is probably just as bad as the political prisoners and the women that are oppressed by the Islamic State. But secondly, even if you tell us that ISIL is even more worse off than Assad, then we tell you that ISIL is already losing the war on popularity. We think that with all these beheadings, with all these atrocities that ISIL is committing, they're already losing out within the world stage, and we think the West has a moral high ground in terms of this fight against ISIL. That's why it was so easy for Congress, for the UK Parliament, for Australian Parliament to also support this war, because ISIL are so bad. So firstly, why is it not necessary to cooperate with Assad? Firstly, we tell you that Iraq is a more crucial military battlefield, because most of the resources that ISIL, that the Islamic State have, are taken from oil fields in Iraq. They take oil and they sell it on the black market, and from those revenues, they buy more weapons. We think that is where the battlefield really should be. But secondly, we tell you that the United States is the best military in the world. And I'm sorry if I sound like I love the United States, but in this instance, we tell you that their military capacity, as well as their intelligence in the region, because we fought a war in Iraq already presents us with enough capacity to defeat them in Iraq. But secondly, even if we do not cooperate with Assad, we tell you it's already in Assad's interest to defeat the IS in Syria already, because IS already want to overthrow Assad, and he has every interest to defeat them. But lastly, Assad still can't win a Syrian civil war with like the Jabhat al-Nusra and the Syrian National Coalition. We don't think we can trust him to fight ISIL either. Second point, why is it bad to cooperate with Assad? I have 5 points here. Firstly, we tell you it's going to demonize the West in the eyes of the international as well as the local setting. Because now what you're going to get is the United States, who have pledged to take down Assad, Obama, who has told Assad, you can't cross this red line. Obama has already promised to intervene in Syria, has now gone back on his word and now promised to help Assad. So what's going to happen is that especially the Islamic world are going to view this as a marrying of two of the biggest enemies of Sunni Islam, America as well as Assad, who comes from an Alawite community. This is going to help ISIL in recruiting even more members and empowers their rhetoric that not just Assad is harmful, but the United States and the West are enemies of us as well. Secondly, we think it's likely you are going to unify Syrian opposition groups to fight the United States as well. Because although ISIL has Islamic ideologies, other Syrian opposition groups who are fighting Assad have democratic ideologies, like the Jabhat al-Nusra, like the Syrian National Council. But now you're telling them that the United States, who used to be their ally, are now fighting with Assad against ISIL. We think what it's likely to do is to marry and amalgamate all these Syrian opposition groups with ISIL as well, and harm the moderation of these groups. They're going to be even more radicalized and start targeting not just Assad, but Western forces as well. So even if your operation is successful in a post-Syrian civil war world, we think you're not going to have friends in the region, and all these moderate groups that you pledge to help are going to turn against you. Thirdly, we think it's also going to make us lose key allies. Like Iraq is not going to be okay with this, ladies and gentlemen, because there's almost so much Sunni Shia friction within Iraq. We don't think that Haider al-Abadi is going to be okay with the United States cooperating with a Shia or an Alawite ally and further radicalize the Shiites and the Sunnis on the ground in Iraq and in Kurdistan. It's going to be even worse. They're not going to want to help us out. Before I move on to my other 2 points, Terence.
South Korea used to be a dictatorship also. Then explain to me why the United States have no qualms in cooperating with them against North Korea.
That's right. And when we did that, that's exactly what helped Russia and China even further help the North. And it made it even harder for us to win the Korean War, ladies and gentlemen. Leads me to my 4th point, anti-war sentiment. We think that now Assad is seen as a humanitarian monster. He's used chemical weapons. He's shot people on the ground indiscriminately. What is likely to happen is that people in America and in the West are not going to want to support the war effort, because they're going to see that their governments are becoming complicit in the crimes and also enforce the crimes that Assad has done already. This is just like when America cooperated with Federico Batista in the Cuban Revolution to try and stem the Fidel Castro movement in the 50s, right? What happened then is that everyone at home never stopped believing in the war. Everyone pulled back their support and made it even harder for us to continue with the war. We think you're going to harm that support on the ground. But lastly, the volatility of Assad. We don't think we can trust Assad, ladies and gentlemen. We think under this model, Assad will feel empowered, because not just has Obama promised military intervention in the past, not just has Obama said, don't cross the red line. Assad has been able to use chemical weapons without repercussions. What we think Assad is going to feel is that he's going to feel empowered. He's going to feel like the West needs him more than he needs the West. So if Assad does anything wrong with this cooperation, everything he does wrong will be seen as complicit with the West. That means the next time Assad breaks a ceasefire, the next time Assad uses chemical weapons, that's exactly when the West will be seen as conduits of those wrongful acts. That's going to harm us in terms of how we enforce international laws and norms in the future. For all these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we can already defeat the Islamic State without Assad, and cooperating will make that even worse. Thank you.
The leader of opposition that speech to lead against societal government because of the deputy prime minister.
We don't think promises are always permanent, right? We don't think that you can use the excuse of a promise to turn a blind eye towards the atrocities that have been committed towards people in Syria, towards the atrocities that have been committed in ISIL that may one day affect you at the end of the day. We don't believe that this idea of the pledge to destroy Assad is mutually exclusive to that side, because you have to recognize the things that Dahlia has already told to you. Yes, we believe that this is a form of alliance, but at the end of the day, this alliance is only military in nature, and we are only using it because we recognize ISIL as the bigger enemy today, especially when it's very relevant now, right? Considering that ISIL has been increasingly mobilizing its force into Syria because of one point, they recognize that US has been helping Iraq and not been willing to help Syria, and therefore Syria is in a more easier position for them to take over, right? This has already shown to you that ISIL is not stupid. You cannot just tell me that Assad can only defeat them when we already painted to you that Aleppo is currently under attack when Assad was busy defending Damascus, right? This is what I'm going to do to you. I'm going to extend Side OG's points by 3, 4, right? Number 1, I'm going to talk about how this will help Syrians on the ground. Number 2, I'll talk about how it provides geopolitical stability. And number 3, on how it is better for global security. But before that, let me rebut Rafiq, right? Sit down myth. Because number 1, he has this idea that, there's this pledge that US has to say to destroy them, and therefore if they break the promise, it will be a form of demonization. We don't think so, right? Because we believe that the idea of this pledge itself that was being made in 2012 is because of the state, because of the immediate reaction towards Assad committing chemical warfare towards the rebels, right? But you have to recognize this, that we can always adjust towards the situation that we face at hand, especially in status quo when IS is recognized as a common enemy by everyone in the world, and they are not only affecting the Syrians, but also affecting the people in the entire Middle East, right? Especially when it comes to US, who has always characterized themselves as the bastion of human rights. We believe that it's more right for them to do so, right? To prevent more lives from getting lost, to prevent more women from being enslaved, and to prevent more tribes from being killed at the end of the day. But secondly, it's this very funny idea that there's no military advantage to this. We don't think so, right? Because let's look at what is happening in status quo. Their so-called ally of Turkey, the Erdogan regime, can't even make up their mind on whether or not they want to help because of the conflicts with Kyrgyzstan, right? This shows to you that there is no strong ally that you can trust at the end of the day. You really need an ally who is situated directly at the area of conflict where you can actually tap into and use the base to directly conquer, to attack ISIL at where it hurts the most. We believe that this strategic ally that we're talking about and of significance is Syria, right? Considering that Turkey does not have this moral initiative because they have not seen the threat yet, we need an ally who has already felt the need to actually do so, and this strong ally comes in the form of Syria. But thirdly, they talk about how now, we demonize US because it's a marriage of two evils, right? Yes, the evil that you're talking about is a so-called Sunni terrorist that's willing to kill moderate Sunnis that don't support their own cause. So we believe that at the end of the day, the Sunnis around the world wouldn't mind if Shia and the US actually collaborate to fight against the evil that has tarnished the name of Muslim, has tarnished the name of Islam as someone who is radical and willing to destroy their own people from their own tribe. That is what we are against, right? But lastly, on the whole idea of volatility of Assad and you cannot trust them, right? Well, we believe that this is a time where Assad has actually needed the help. I'll explain to you later how Assad alone cannot handle it, and now's the time that you can actually make sure that he actually holds on to his promise to you, because now he also desperately needs it, and it's not a form of political leverage or a form of sympathy towards you. Right, sit down, Rafiq. Let's move on to my first substantive, right, on how this will help Syrians on the ground. Because you have to look at the current fight in Syria, right? Something like opening opposition has been mischaracterizing. They're saying that, okay, we can leave Assad to fight the ISIL in Syria itself because he's doing okay with it. We don't think so, right? Because you have to understand the situation that Syria is in. Dalia has already explained to you that Syria doesn't have a lot of allies on the ground itself. What does this mean, right? This means that two things. Number one, they have limited military capacities to actually fight the idea of ISIL. But number two, they are only withhold to their own geopolitical area of Syria itself. Because you have to understand this, right? With the money and capabilities, the limited capabilities that as they are constantly defending Damascus and leaving the areas which are actually under attack by ISIL to their whim, right? We have already shown you places like the places bordering Iraq, the places bordering Turkey, the town of Aleppo I've illustrated to you. These are the areas that Assad has no choice but to let go because they still have to maintain Damascus, right? These are the areas that Assad has shown willing to help but can't do so simply because they lack the military capabilities to do so. So we believe that our proposal better helps the population as a whole, because even if you want to argue with me that Assad has not been a very good leader, at least under our paradigm we provide them a safer place to stay where they will not constantly get killed, and they will not get killed because they are a certain faction of Muslims in nature, right? We believe that at the end of the day, it's always between a trade-off and the choosing of the lesser of two evils. Because I understand this, right? We must always protect human rights at stake. When lives are constantly being killed, when lives are constantly being taken away from you, you have to stop that first before you move on to another thing. We have never said we will concede morally with Assad. We are just using him as a temporary ally to actually combat the problem that's at stake. Before I move on to my second substantive closing.
Okay, what's to stop Bashar al-Assad from taking all these weapons and then turning it against the Free Syrian Army or whoever he feels like massacring that day?
Well, you can always, the fact that US can actually attack them now and give them more legitimacy to attack them if they do something wrong, but we believe that they won't do so because at the end of the day, you must recognize that the common enemy that we have at hand is ISIL itself. So we believe that there is no idea for this form of rebellion or providing a military weapon to actually attack the Free Syrian people when their own people are at attack, right? But let's move on to the second idea on how we provide geopolitical stability, because you have to understand the very unique position that this debate is taking place is in the heart of Middle East itself. We believe that there is always the idea of spillover effect, right? Where this is not only harmful to Syria but harmful to Iraq, Turkey, and also other places around there as well. We believe that number two, progression is halted at that. Number one, the economical progression of these countries, but secondly, the social progression and the lives that you're talking about. These are all at risk because the idea that more and more people, more and more factors are entering into this equation, that anytime if you don't stop ISIL now, there's a chance that they might recruit more moderate terrorists to actually fight for them. This is a threat that you must stop immediately. So we believe that at the end of the day, it's better to deal with Assad than ISIL because number one, he's more diplomatic, and number two, he has shown tendencies of dismantling chemical weapons when Russia and US actually tell them to do so. This means that they are not crazy lunatics like ISIL who's willing to decapitate people and willing to enslave women in the name of religion. But thirdly, right, how this will actually provide global security to people, because you have to understand the terrorist organization that we're talking about is ISIL, right? It's a form of global threat because they're constantly encroaching into other territories that contains Muslim as well, because their main idea at the end is to form a caliphate that comprises of Muslim. What does this mean, right? This means that more often than not, they have genocidal tendencies to actually kill people in their way. This has included a lot of tribes, right? Just a list of them: Zoroastrians, Yazidis, Shias, even moderate Sunnis who are disagreeing with their ways of terrorism, right? We believe that it's very harmful because at the end of the day, you have to recognize that this jihadist movement is gaining traction in the Western world itself, where there's this constantly recruitment. If we do not stop them immediately, we won't be able to stop them now. What has Syed OG tell you, right? We've already shown you how it's always better to prioritize, and this trade-off is a willing one because it's the choosing of two of the lesser evils, and how this will actually provide is better for both the West and Syria. We're back to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech to engage the side of the opposition because of the Deputy Leader of the day.
ladies and gentlemen, in my speech, I'll be talking to you on probably opening government's best case scenario. What if we do beat IS? What are the long-term implications even then? And we'll tell you why, from opening opposition, that the repercussions of cooperating with probably what's seen as the second largest enemy of Sunni Muslims around the world, Bashar al-Assad, is going to create a crucible of hate and long-term conflict in not only Syria, but also the region, ladies and gentlemen. But before that, I'll answer you 3 questions in my speech. I think it's worth noting that plenty of the analysis that came out in Rafiq's speech was left unresponded to by the opening government. The fact that anti-war sentiment as well as the anti-Shiite sentiment isn't just restricted to people on the ground. It is also affected by the fact that the United States of America and many Western countries experience war fatigue today because of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and are oftentimes reluctant in entering conflict because they've seen that the United States of America have cooperated with many demonic actors in society today. What more if we cooperate with individuals that your very own president has said that we will never cooperate, we will never negotiate with Bashar al-Assad? At this point, we think it's very likely that the United States of America and many Western allies will, and their people and voters will pressure their politicians saying, we don't want war anymore. Then the fight in Iraq, which is why I pointed out in the POI, ladies and gentlemen, will be severely weakened. That's where their resources are, and that's why it's so important. But secondly, what Rafiq told you is that it was very important for us to maintain the support of Haider al-Abidi and Iraqi citizens, ladies and gentlemen, because of all the resources, the banks as well as the oil fields in Iraq. Because once you lose the moderate Haider al-Abidi support, ladies and gentlemen, that's when you lose the Peshmerga forces, you lose Iraqi forces, ladies and gentlemen, and you lose the ability to win the war where it matters, because Haider al-Abidi is unlikely to want to support a war where the West is now in support of the symbolism, ladies and gentlemen, of all the Shiite as well as Sunni conflict within their own forces. Haider al-Abidi is barely hanging on to power at the moment right now. That means you will lose the war where it actually matters, where all the resources are concentrated, because you want a token measure of fighting the war in Syria where it's absolutely not necessary. Secondly, let's answer this question, ladies and gentlemen. Is ISIL winning at this point in time? We think not. In fact, their characterization belies their own arguments, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that they face massive unpopularity today. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, they've already been losing the kind of ground that they've garnered in the first few months of their offensive. They've lost the Mosul dam. In fact, they've lost Mosul, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, many Iraqi forces are sieging Raqqa as we speak right now. That means the ISIL or IS, ladies and gentlemen, are losing ground as we speak because they are unable to sustain their entire army based on just their resources and the unpopularity that they've garnered so far, ladies and gentlemen. That means, what's the conclusion of all that? That means the Iraqi forces as well as the United States Army can defeat ISIS in Iraq, ladies and gentlemen, and cutting off their resources, still defeat them, weaken ISIS in Syria, and still have Bashar al-Assad fight them anyway, ladies and gentlemen, without having to taint the reputation of the West, ladies and gentlemen, in the eyes of the global public. This is a strategic move. If you can already defeat an enemy without tainting your own image in the process, why are you taking the horrible way out in this instance, ladies and gentlemen? We think it's exceptionally important for you to maintain politically strategic. Secondly, we think there was a false characterization on opening government. They seem to think that we're not helping Syrians at all. Like Rafiq told you, we're not willing to knock on the door, ask for Bashar al-Assad's permission, have some kuih muih with him, and then say, now we're going to help the Syrian opposition. We didn't care now, and we're not going to care later. We're already performing airstrikes in Syria as we speak. We're already having 8 organizations operating as we speak. We've established God how many green zones in Aleppo, Damascus, without Bashar al-Assad's permission at all, under status quo. Having Bashar al-Assad's permission isn't going to change that. In fact, secondly, if they really think that we need a regional actor in order to support us, it's definitely not Bashar al-Assad. Why? Because we already have the Syrian opposition as we speak right now that helped us establish those green zones. We have moderates. We have, prior to the IS coming and taking over cities, the opposition was already in control of many cities in Syria, ladies and gentlemen. This means that Rafiq's argument was exceptionally important. If these individuals feel like they are losing the war because Bashar al-Assad has no qualms with using the weapons and the support of the West and turn them, as closing mentioned in the POI, against the Syrian opposition themselves, ladies and gentlemen. That means the Syrian opposition just might be defeated by the exact support that you're giving towards Bashar al-Assad. And we think that's exceptionally important in terms of long-term sustainability. Lastly, I think this is a broadly illogical fallacy from opening government. The IS is a common enemy of everyone. Yeah, sure, she's a common enemy if you're not a desperate Sunni Muslim living in Syria or Iraq, ladies and gentlemen. If you're an individual, in fact, if you're an individual that's Sunni, a lot of individuals are already attracted to the IS mission of establishing caliphate. That's why 60% of their recruits are from first world countries, ladies and gentlemen, and expatriates that fly down into, in fact, for God's sake, Malaysians are flying out and joining ISIS, for instance. And these are individuals not even affected. That means there are individuals that are being galvanized by the message that if you cooperate with the enemy, the West, but now with Bashar al-Assad, ladies and gentlemen, furthermore, that recruitment will be galvanized, ladies and gentlemen, and strengthen ISIS forces when we're already defeating them at the moment. We think opening government is sufficiently out of this debate. I'll take opening.
It's nice to think that the war on ISIL can be solely won in Iraq or Syria, right? Which is the bigger threat to the people? Someone who has attacked extremist Muslims in the past, or someone who is actively killing moderate Muslims in Syria and Iraq?
No. This is not a battle about messages. This is about Bashar al-Assad already willing to fight them, but where they're garnering their most strength, their oil fields and their money, is where it's in Iraq. But we need to maintain the support in Iraq. You need to catch up to the debate, Patrick. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's go on to my substantive material. Now, what do we do once we defeat IS in the future, ladies and gentlemen? We think it's more likely than not that this will be a temporary victory if we do actually achieve victory. Why so? Because we've already seen that trying to militarily destroy terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda becomes unsuccessful, because IS was a splinter of Al-Qaeda after we thought we defeated them, because we never really defeated them on an ideological platform, ladies and gentlemen. That means if we concede our morals, concede our principles in terms of democracy, as well as cooperating with an anti-Sunni leader like Bashar al-Assad, it's more likely that that rhetoric will be used later in the future to resurface extremist rhetoric, and we think that it will harm Iraq and harm Syrian progression later on. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot legitimize Bashar al-Assad. We cannot legitimize the impunity as well as the humanitarian disrespect that they have inflicted upon not only Syrians, but the world. That only happens with government. Side with opposition if you want to save lives, side with opposition if you side with humanity. I'm exceedingly proud to oppose.
Okay, we thank the deputy leader of the opposition. Let's conclude the opening half. To kick off the back half, we've got a bunch of members as well.
Woo!
They've created a wasteland and they call it peace. They say they don't want Sunnis to be more radicalized, yet they encourage us to not take sides and cooperate with the Shias in order to actually make sure we don't antagonize the Sunnis anymore. That is the tautological logic that comes from side opening opposition here. But let's look where exactly has this debate gone through. We have an opening government that decides to think that my enemy is my friend, just like how I cooperate with Mukris. But let's look how opening opposition talk about the idea of the implication on the future, what happens after, assuming that we win the war. Firstly, we also have to tackle the idea that somehow we have to win the war in Iraq first. Look, we can see to that. We will go and fight in Iraq if we need to. If we need to cooperate with the Peshmergas, we can continue that. But to say that you need to pick one side over the other, that forces everyone to polarize against each other. That means that Kurdistan could never cooperate with Syria in the future. But when you actually cooperate with Assad, is that you are sending a message. Look, in the future, both of you can work together because you have done it in the past. You may have a temporary alliance, but that will be taught down through generations and say that that is the benchmark where the Middle East have united against a common enemy, and that will be good. The second problem at the end of the day is that they said somehow you demonize America's position within it. Look, if you were to encourage, saying that you should never cooperate with the Shias anymore, that is going to demonize the United States at the end of the day, because that's even worse. Because you continuously encourage the divide between the two groups and the two groups. Right now, America is working with the UAE, where the UAE has been bombing ISIS in general, and UAE is a huge majority. The majority would be Sunnis in these countries. So what is perceived right now is that America is only aligning itself with Sunnis, but never ever wants to take the chance to align itself with Shia. Despite whatever position that Assad took in the past, at least that is the first step on how the West practically can somehow consolidate with Shia, especially when the huge rift that America has with Iran, considering enforcing and emboldening the idea that Shias could never work with Sunnis and the United States in general. And lastly, the huge tautological idea coming from MIDP in general. He said that we should never ever cooperate with a Shia person, because that person has been the symbol of what Sunnis have been actually somehow stood for. But yet, that is the same reason why IS becomes radical in the first place. The very fact that Shia exists as an enemy. But if you somehow dilute the idea that Shia is not the enemy, that's where everyone decides to not be radical. Closing government would show to you how a three-way battle is ridiculous, because you have to go to war against Assad in the future, and how we foster unity in the Middle East. But before I move on, yes.
The difference between, say, Iran and Iraq, who do have Shia, and, say, Bashar Al-Assad, is that Bashar Al-Assad is a poster boy of using chemical weapons against Sunnis. That's why we get to cooperate with Shias, just not the person that's slaughtering them.
Look, you can prosecute them later, but to use the administration as an assistant and a tool within the war is much more valuable than those kind of battles. We think those kind of things still can be stood up within the court of law, and that is not the debate. First extension, this position is better in a three-way battle. Let's look at the condition right now. Is that US is arming rebels in Syria. US is already doing drone strikes. You already have Kurdistan troops, the Peshmerga troops on one area, and you have Assad's administration going through two different battles. There is no form of centralized system. Everyone is fragmented, and there is an overlap when it comes to war. So that means there is possibility that two groups might attack two different areas that are not so important, when the fact is one side might have information why a certain area that is much more crucial, and no one has this kind of information. There is already precedence to this on how the United States have actively assisted South Korea to fight against the North Korean War. His answer to my POI earlier on, somehow Russia and China would somehow align to North Korea, that is logical, because they already share the same ideology in the first place. So regardless what happens, they would definitely back up North Korea. But the important part is that they managed to turn South Korea into a democratic state in the future, and somehow stop North Korea from overwhelming the whole region, and somehow stop communism and put a line at the 30th parallel. And that is a good example how a dictatorship becomes even more moderate, because in the past they have actively joined the US forces and somehow become much more moderate in general. But here's the third part. Why the concentrated effort is better? Because firstly, you stop straining resources like what the United States is doing. United States doing right now is that because they want to antagonize Syria continuously, they keep on arming the Syrian rebels, rather than getting the Syrian rebels to join the Assad forces and force them to work together against ISIS in general. And the Kurdistan Peshmerga troops are acting in a separate, different group rather than sharing resources. But here's also an important part, is that now, answering the question, what is the added benefit of actively working together with Syria, is that now you are able to surround IS geographically. You have the Kurds acting at the north and Iraq on the east, but somehow at least you now allow Syria to control the west, and you put them into a position where they are landlocked in general. Without Syria's help, IS can overrun Aleppo, and the West have to deal with that later on. That means the war becomes even longer rather than having a temporary alliance. So when IS has a grip on Syria, and that can be, and US has to intervene into that, then US will be blamed for extending the war to another area. At least you are able to confine the war to a certain part and make it stop geographically. But here's the third part, is that now you reduce military spending when it comes to the United States. That is why the United States always have a policy where you only fight on two fronts, rather than actually attacking on two fronts, rather than actually attacking on multiple battles. It's how that makes it even more complicated. But the best part is where you share intelligence and you are able to coordinate attacks together
rather than doing random things. Because right now, Kurdistan is only acting independently on its own, where at certain points, they would also want to attack the northern part of Syria and somehow continuously antagonize Bashar al-Assad, because they think that chunk over there is actually a part of the original Kurdistan homeland. But if you actively create a border and say that, look, these are the limitations within the constitution of our alliance, that means they have a less likely to have an incentive to attack Bashar al-Assad first, but work against IS first before doing anything else. So at least within that time period, you are able to work into a concentrated effort and share intelligence on the ground. But here's the conclusion, is that you force unity between both Shia and Sunnis. Why so? Because the first precedents where United States did not take a side. Which one is better? Is this a problem between Sunnis only, or this is a problem within the region altogether? So when the Shias and the Sunnis somehow work together, they are less likely to be polarized, and America would not be demonized as the reason why is there a huge polarization within the United States. Just like how we became friends of Mukris, we believe that this would actually reduce polarization.
I think we thank the member of Club, and the start of case closing opposition, the member of all.
We don't understand why government continually characterizes Bashar al-Assad as this angel, as this person who will just give back the weapons, as this person who will, for sure, will do whatever the US does and kiss their feet, right? Because we think that's the exact opposite of what Bashar al-Assad will do. While opening opposition has told you about how this has long-term consequences for the war, we'll tell you directly how this is definitely going to lose the war in Syria against IS, right? So first, let's go to my first issue, right? Is Bashar al-Assad a reliable ally, and does he add anything of value to the war, right? Number one, we think that as an ally, he's an extremely atrocious person, right? He's committed atrocity against his people. He's like chemically massacred them. He's condoned rape against his own people, right? This side never guarantees that that harm will come towards these individuals the moment that happens. We think that's a huge harm that occurs under your proposal, right? But secondly, the Syrians on the ground, we have to understand that Bashar al-Assad is also is still against the IS to begin with. That means whether you ally with Bashar al-Assad or not, he is still going to fight the IS in the first place, right? This is why, like, the main reason why we ally with the UK is because if not, they won't do anything about it, right? Given the fact that Bashar al-Assad doesn't actually add value by us allying with him, we think that there's no added value to it, right? Let's look at what OG brought up. The only thing that OG brought up, right? He said, like, on a comparative, at least these guys get to stay with Bashar al-Assad instead of IS. Yeah, they get to stay with the people who rape them and who use chemical weapons against them, right? But let's look, is IS actually worse for these individuals, right? Because IS is against the US. They behead US journalists, they behead US people. They don't really like commit atrocities against those Syrian people to begin with, unlike what Bashar al-Assad does, right? Like, where does IS get its recruitment from? It gets it from these people to begin with. They don't have incentive to do that to begin with. So on a comparative, you fall out, right? People are actually probably worst off under Bashar al-Assad regime. Let's look at the extension brought onto this side of the house, right? The only thing he brought up was, he said, look, we add value because now we can surround IS geographically and it'd be fantastic for them, right? We think that's wrong on two levels. First of all, you forget the fact that there are so many other militant groups, right? Like there's the FSA, there's the Syrian militant group, there's the Shias, there's the Sunnis. Like, there's also the Christian Syrian militant group. The fact that you're completely unable to surround them geographically means that they still have other escape routes, right? But secondly, you forgot that IS always has this escape route called Iraq. So if you want to surround them geographically and starve them off to death so that they're unable to have weapons funneled into them, you can't do that because Iraq is right behind them, right? And they can still continuously have weapons funneled into them. Here's what I'm going to argue to you in this debate, right? First of all, I'll tell you how it allows IS to guarantee its income into things and impede our ability to have things like sanctions and negotiations. I'm also going to tell you how it directly gives him the tools to kill individuals and how that loses us the support on the ground and how that support is so important to winning the war. Okay, let's look at how we guarantee IS income, right? Let's look at the tools we have to stop IS. Because, like, one of the most important ways that we stop these individuals or stop Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi it's implying sanctions against these individuals, right? Because we're directly cooperating with Bashar al-Assad, we lose all whatever legitimacy we had with the US in negotiating with other countries like Russia and China. Like the reason why we could never grab a foothold in Libya, and the reason why it took 50 years for us to take down Iran even after 50 years of sanctions, is because Russia and China took down the never back down strategy, right? Because they would always be supporting these individuals. Let's look at who's the individual that's really supporting IS in this picture, right? Like, where does IS get its money from to begin with? Number one, we have to understand that IS smuggles like $3 million barrels worth of oil into Turkey. And the way they do it is, right, like they'll just smuggle it across the border and they'll do it openly. They'll like sell it to gas houses at like a fraction of the price, and the Turkish government doesn't care about anything. So what do we have to do under this scenario, right? We have to make sure that we get the Turkish government to stop IS handing this money to begin with. How do we do that? Well, number one, we're extremely impeded from doing so if we don't have the legitimacy to negotiate with Turkey to begin with. Because we understand, right? Like if Turkey wants to stop, or if Turkey, the only way to get Turkey to stop is for us to put heavy pressure on these individuals, and we lose that legitimacy the moment we get it from Bashar al-Assad, right? So that huge amount of income that funds IS and that funds like all of their weapons has to come from Turkey to begin with. My second extension is about how we're also lose our primary ability to have airstrikes to be or neuter our ability to use it to begin with, right? We're directly giving him the tools. The first thing is that Bashar al-Assad is a horrible individual, right? Like we're giving him the tools to directly kill his individuals. We think this is something that not a lot of people, like nobody else explored in this debate. The fact is this: if you're going to use alliances, and we have to think about how alliances work, right? They're necessarily long-term. Any training that you give to Bashar al-Assad will stick. Any militants that you give to Bashar al-Assad will stick. That means that he can use these weapons, and he can use these weapons against those individuals on the ground the moment that war against IS has ended, and not even like before the war on IS has ended, right? We think that he can also use it against the Free Syrian Army. We think he can also use it against the Syrian militants. The reason why this will lose us on the ground is twofold. The first thing is that we have to understand that the Free Syrian Army is also against IS to begin with, right? Like impeding or helping Bashar al-Assad means impeding the FSA, which means that we're ultimately impeding the fight against it to begin with, right? Because these individuals are less likely to fight against each other, we think that it makes it much more difficult for them, right? But we also have to think about the perspective and the legitimacy of the individuals on the ground, right? Because like our main method of killing the IS right now is airstrikes. That requires reliable ground intel, and that's not something we have if we don't have the support of the individuals. Like an Iraqi soldier is more likely to die from a poisoned oil well from a civilian rather than from an IED, right? Like what occurs is that civilians are more likely to hide IS forces and more likely to help out IS forces, thereby neutering our only method of stopping these individuals from doing so, right? But they also use this as a tactic for propaganda, right? Because the civilians are more likely to recruit them, that means that the US has to go and do despicable things like bombing civilian airstrikes or like civilian airstrikes against their own people, right? They don't have a differentiation between who really is IS, who's the FSA, and who we're helping, right? Here's what I told you in this debate. We're going to lose the war against IS if we take Bashar al-Assad. He's an atrocious individual who only hates his own people. We think ultimately what we do on our side, we proved how it's going to help the war against, it's going to win the war against IS. We also proved how in the long term we do it far better under our proposal. I'm very proud to oppose.
Okay, we thank the member of opposition to conclude side government for on the halfway.
Although the enemy of my enemy might seem to be my friend, the present ISIL vision is a great threat to regional stability in the Middle East, and that's why we seek to solve the problem right now. Not because this ISIL movement is something that's strong, Mr. Speaker, but because what seems to be the only solution that exists within this debate right now is one where we only decide to fight ISIL on a fragmented body on several fronts. Meaning a war that Syria necessarily could win is not a war that Iraq wins, it's not a war that Kurdistan can also win at the same time. Side of closing opposition seeks to prove only one thing, that it is better for us to have a concentrated effort against ISIL than a war on multiple fronts. That first thing, Mr. Speaker, is that we ensure that this war against ISIL is one that we solve first before we move on to other things that you want to talk about on the side of opposition. Before that, several points of rebuttal going against side of closing opposition. The first thing that they had to say was this, that, hey, look, let's not just cooperate with the Bashar Al-Assad regime, but instead we can cooperate with the regime that exists within Turkey in itself, or even the Peshmerga groups that exist within a country. Look, it's simple, Mr. Speaker, that we don't think that the Kurds can also just focus on a certain region that on the war against Syria, right? Because Syria doesn't really have to bother with what Kurdistan's Peshmerga troops have to do. That's the reason why the Peshmerga really wanted to enter the kind of war that we had against ISIL, but the only reason that they could do so was only through Iraq. We think that when you have a certain conceited war effort, or when we have a concentrated war effort, it's one where we understand that there's one common enemy that all of the sides have to go through. We don't see why it's not mutually exclusive to only ask for the help of Turkey, Mr. Speaker, but we can necessarily conjoin as a war effort with Syria, with even Iraq, or even to the largest extent the Peshmerga groups that exist within Kurdistan to also fight against the huge battle against ISIL. But the first issue that I want to talk about is this, Mr. Speaker, that how is it better under a concentrated war effort, and how do we do that? We talked about this in two ways. The first way we talked about is this, how it's better than a three-way effort, but rather we have a concentrated effort on the side. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, how you focus the sides under one common enemy and why that's a benefit as a whole. What is the debate that had to exist within today's room? That the war against ISIL isn't one where a Sunni country assumes that when a Shiite or an Alawite country is one that is being attacked, that's your own problem. We won't really help you with that kind of problem that you have. But the other logic that we have to follow is this, that when a Shiite country necessarily wins a battle against ISIL, that's one where Syria doesn't necessarily also benefit from that. So we want to talk about a debate where it's also about all these forces coming together as a conjoined effort along with the capability of the West to help. Sure, we understand that the concern that comes from side of opposition is one, but we have to look into some Sunnis where they have a certain concern with the West cooperating with Bashar Al-Assad, who seems to be an Alawite, who can also turn against his country right now. What do we have to say to this, Mr. Speaker? That firstly, your ability to be offended by who is cooperating with who on the status quo is trumped by the more pertinent fact, which is this, that ISIL is the more existential threat that exists within status quo, and it's one that we seek to solve firstly. That's why it's alarmingly serious that when ISIL robbed banks within Mosul and gained millions from it, Mr. Speaker, they gain more power, they buy more arms, they have more money than I would probably ever make in my life, Mr. Speaker. But the second thing is this, even before that, the West in a form of aid, right, has also helped certain dictators such as the South Korean dictator in also overthrowing the North Korean conflict or the Commie conflict that exists within that. And even then, Mr. Speaker, South Korea turned out fine. We don't think how it cannot apply a certain parallel there. But what do we also have to say to the other things that existed, to the other things that they wanted to talk about right now? That firstly, it's this. How can cooperation be a unilateral front that forces the kind of unity we want under the side of closing opposition? That's why Terence's extension was largely important within this debate, and extending to you, Mr. Speaker, in showing you how as a unilateral form of attack, we can further mitigate the kind of problems that you have. Sit down, Rafiq. But what do both sides have to concede to in order for this debate to exist? That we have to know that within the Middle East, ISIL seems to be the largest existential threat that exists right now. Not about how Bashar al-Assad is going to bomb these other people once you get all the arms that we provide you with, right? Opposition only had a problem with the kind of polarization and the kind of image that you send as a certain West country who probably only helps an Alawite country, and the kind of image that you send towards the Sunni people. Because even then, Mr. Speaker, we have to concede to this, that both the Sunni and the Alawite countries are countries which are fighting against the ISIL combatants right now. That's why it's constantly, but right now it seems that it's only constantly seen as two fronts, which is fighting the ISIL battle rather than just one front. That's why even in the UAE, which seems to be largely a Sunni country, cooperates with the West to fight ISIL. That shows us one thing, that even though we provide them certain arms and training towards the UAE to fight ISIL, we recognize the fact that as a Sunni country, it's very much possible for you to still fight against ISIL there. But the inclusion is to show this, Mr. Speaker, that it's a battle of the same effort, not just by Sunni countries, but also how we can help allied countries such as Bashar Al-Assad to also fight against ISIL. Before I move on, I'll take the handsome one.
Once the United States regains territory as well as oil fields in Iraq, ISIL will be left to die out in Syria. But don't you think the ideological precedent that the United States has gotten into bed with an enemy who has infringed international laws will likely perpetuate conflict against the West?
So the only problem that you probably had was this, right? What happens right now when you only show to a Sunni country that you're helping out an Alawite country, right? Look, it's easy. All Mirzal's concerns about how Haidar Abidi might be unwilling to help US is this, right? That what if ISIL finally knocks on your door on these oil fields and certainly want to intervene within you, right? We think that less likely you'll be a fragment which will not be polarized by the kinds of help that you want from the West. But the second thing that we told you is this, Mr. Speaker, that your only concern of what image you send when you help certain Alawite countries is one where Syria is only even more scared by the kind of existential threat that ISIL serves to seek. But also the image that we send as a conjoined effort is one where we see that the more atrocities that ISIL seems to commit is this. That the only way that the West was ushered to help in an effort is how we've always seen other countries as being oppressed. That's why when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, that provoked the US-led coalition to help the certain government in itself. That resulted in the Gulf War, Mr. Speaker. We don't think why it cannot apply here even then. That's why since then the US administration has always had a certain incentivization to help the countries which were always oppressed by other countries. But another concern that they had was, look, Assad seems to be a poster boy of what gassing your own people seems to be. We don't think that's mutually exclusive, Mr. Speaker, because ironically, we are the exact country that's helping UAE. We are exactly the kind of country that's helping Syria. We think that unilateral front is one that we have to take, Mr. Speaker, not a fragmented body that only wins its own wars. It's one war that everyone has to gain from, but nothing to lose. Thank you.
Right, we thank the government for that speech. To conclude this debate, the operator.
Was really nice, right? Hearing to Terrence's speech and then hearing to Mukli's speech, they give fluffy words to explain their fluffy ideas. But then again, the ideas weren't really that strong because the two things that they brought up was basically this. Number one, hey, we can send message to people that you can unify and you can fight the common enemy. And the second thing, like, look, we want to have IS surrounded, therefore they can't run away anywhere. Before going on to these two arguments, let's look what we tried to argue about. Number one, in Sharif's speech, what he essentially argued is that we can now never make alliance with countries like Turkey and all the stuff, in which is vital in IS sustainability, because like what Sharif explained to you, that how IS has been smuggling, selling oils to Turkey, and this is their life and all. Like what happens then? It's harder for you to make an allegiance with Turkey, because now you're forming an allegiance with Turkey's enemy, with Turkey enemies, which is Basad, which is the international enemy, which will then leads to us having more, which then having IS would have more support rather than losing support Further, second, they never really responded to that. But secondly, right, like what Sharif also argued to you know, how Bashar is a ruthless person. Like he never considered to he never really thinks about his citizens. Now, what happens when you give more military aid to Bashar al-Assad? It's like he will start to bomb unconditionally. Like he will start to bomb his people also. Now, what happens then? You give him justification to bombing his own citizens. Because right now he would always say like, look, I'm trying to bomb the IS, the citizens are on the way, it's justified and all those shit. Like, look, they never rebutted to that. We believe our argument stands that it differs from the side opening, therefore we hold a place within today's debate. Now, going on to two things that they wanted to argue, right? Number one, you send a message, sit down. You send a message that they can help each other, like how it happened with North Korea and South Korea and all this stuff. Like, look, you never put things into context here, because now we're talking about helping Bashar al-Assad, who created genocide, who used chemical weapons against his own citizens. Now, what happens here is that essentially he's gonna bomb his people either way, unlike North Korea, because right now the people you help within North Korea want to eradicate this dictator, but now you're helping the dictator to eradicate the people. It's totally different in context, therefore it's exacerbating the things. But second of all, right, like, look, if you want to unify Shia and Sunni and all those things, like, why Bashar al-Assad? Because Bashar al-Assad have always have this bad track records, like the atrocities that he done. Like, if you want to make allegiance with Shia and all this Shia, why not go with Iraq? Why not go with other people? We don't understand why Bashar al-Assad. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Second of all, right, the thing that they wanted to argue, which is we want to surround IS geographically. Number one, they are already surrounded. Like, the people in Turkey are fighting against them. Like, people in Syria are also fighting against them and all those stuff. Like, essentially they are already surrounded, but they always have Iraq as an escape route. Now, if you want to talk about wanting to put them in one place in which they can't run away and want to kill them, it's Iraq, not Syria. And Sharif and I have already given you multiple explanation to why, when you help Bashar al-Assad, it's never going to work. Before going on to the real issue, yes, any one of you.
Your concern about Assad regime bombing your own people doesn't really have to wait for the US to even harm them in the first place. But how exactly do you solve the polarization problem in the Middle East when you encourage Sunnis to now go into a war against Syria?
Look, what you do is you exacerbate. You give more weapon, he can kill more people. If you don't give them more weapon, if you don't give Bashar al-Assad any weapon, like, we can limit all those numbers. But then again, like the polarizing thing you want to say, it's worse under your condition, because right now people see that United States are helping Bashar al-Assad kill these people. What happens that these people would be more likely to turn into IS, which Sharif had already argued. What happens then? People will hide these IS members within their area in order to fight against Bashar al-Assad. You create a common enemy also within IS and within the FSA, which will be more detrimental, because now you cannot track down on the specific people that you want to target, on the specific people within the region that you want to kill, that you want to take down. It's very bad. Sit down. Going on to the issues, the opening side and wanted to argue was that, look, we should form an allegiance with Syria because it's more strategic. Like, Bashar al-Assad already fighting them, but Bashar al-Assad are failing. Yes, they considered that Bashar al-Assad is also evil, but then again, it's a thing to choose between the lesser evil and all those stuff. Sit down. Like, first, I have three responses to this. Firstly, like, Assad is still not winning against the rebels. Like, what strategic are you talking about here? Like, even with the rebel, he's not winning. Like, why are you wanting to form an allegiance with a person who cannot even fight their own people? But second of all, right? Like, yeah, Bashar al-Assad have already committed atrocities and all. Their side never prove to you on how by giving him weapon he won't do genocide. By giving them more weapon, he will only attack IS. Then that's the only thing he will do. Our side proved to you on how Bashar al-Assad will still bomb unconditionally and all this stuff. But third of all, right, you further intensify
intensify conflicts, because right now people would be more likely to turn to IS for support, because hey, United States are going like their back again, are showing their back against us. Now he's supporting Bashar al-Assad, not supporting us anymore. We should now go and seek for help from IS. You intensify the clash within the people, intensify the clashes here. What essentially will happen then is that what will happen then is that you kill more civilians, more will die, more casualty. But second of all, right, the strategic thing that they wanted to argue was close proximity. Like, look, no, it's close. Yes, we don't deny it's close, but then again, there's no necessity to it, because you can see the trends. Like Syria is pushing. There's already trends like Syria pushing their borders, IS throughout their borders. Like Iraq also, other countries also pushing IS away from their borders. The close airstrikes by US military have already been proven effective. Therefore, this is no necessity. But second of all, right, if you want to talk about close proximity, you need to kill the base, which is in Iraq. Now, we've proven to you on how it's not strategic for us to go with Bashar al-Assad, and therefore we should never go with Bashar al-Assad. Go with side government opposition.